Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really challenging topic, the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex, and usually we hear one main narrative, but this source you shared, it takes a very different angle.
Exactly. We've got this document, the shadowwar.pdf, and look, it's not your standard news analysis. It puts forward a pretty distinct, maybe even controversial viewpoint.
Right. So our job today in this deep dive is really to unpack what this specific source is arguing. It doesn't just point the finger at Russia or Putin.
No, not at all. The document lays out this deeper narrative that the war is significantly driven by U.S. foreign policy. It frames it almost as a calculated strategy, to weaken Russia, expand Western influence.
And the source pulls from quite a range of things to back this up. It mentions declassified U.S. documents, statements from officials, WikiLeaks stuff, FOIA requests.
Even academic works like Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard.
Right, so it's citing a variety of materials.
So just to be clear for everyone listening, we're going to walk you through the points and the evidence presented in this document. We're doing this impartially.
Yeah, we're just laying out its case. We're not saying we agree or disagree. It's about understanding the perspective this source offers.
Think of us as guides, navigating the arguments inside the shadowwar.pdf.
Exactly. Understanding this argument, how it's constructed.
Okay, let's get into it. How does this document portray the conflict as potentially a U.S.-crafted move on the geopolitical chessboard?
Well, it starts, logically enough, with some historical context. It really emphasizes Ukraine's position as a key geopolitical pivot point.
And it jumps right in referencing Zbigniew Brzezinski's 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard. There's that quote.
The famous one, "Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire."
Right. And the document uses this to say, look, this idea was sort of foundational to U.S. thinking, that influencing Ukraine was seen as the key to kind of containing Russia.
And the source then tries to connect that strategic idea to actual U.S. policy that followed, especially NATO expansion after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah, that's the next big piece. The document highlights how, despite those, early verbal assurances in the 90s about NATO not moving 1 inch eastward,
14 countries ended up joining.
many run up against Russia's borders.
And the source claims there's evidence for this awareness. It cites declassified CIA memos, meeting minutes from the 90s, apparently available through places like the National Security Archive.
What do those documents show, according to the source?
According to the source, they show U.S. and NATO officials knew, like explicitly knew, that Russia would see this expansion as a direct threat. It wasn't a surprise.
Okay, so the source is building this picture of known consequences, and then it points to a specific event where things really escalated.
Yeah, the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, that's where the declaration came out, saying Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO.
And the document really hammers this point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Calling it a red line for Russia.
It does. It emphasizes that this wasn't just talk. U.S. officials apparently knew it was a red line. It brings up that 2008 cable from William Burns.
Who is ambassador to Russia then, now CIA director.
Right. The cable titled "Net means Yet." And the source says Burns warned Washington that for the Russian elite, not just Putin, but the whole elite, Ukraine and NATO was the brightest of all red lines.
So the argument the source is making is U.S. strategy plus actions like the Bucharest Declaration consciously created a situation Russia saw as deeply provocative.
That's exactly the picture it paints. And from that point, the document pivots to 2014, the Maidan uprising in Ukraine.
And again, it doesn't just describe it as, people power.
No, it suggests there was significant U.S. involvement sort of steering things.
It points to specifics, like that leaked phone call with Victoria Nuland.
Assistant Secretary of State at the time.
Yeah, where she's heard discussing who should be in the next Ukrainian government before the president, Yanukovych, was even out.
And that infamous F the EU line on the same call. The source interprets that as showing the U.S. kind of going it alone, deciding things.
The source also mentions Nuland's speech, I think, from 2014.
Yes, to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, where she said the U.S. had invested over $5 billion in, quote, promoting democracy in Ukraine since '91. The source links that money to the 2014 events.
And it notes the outcome. The interim government that came in after Yanukovych fled was very much aligned with the West. Pro-Russian figures were out.
So according to the source, this whole sequence fits what it calls a color revolution playbook. It even mentions critics, cited in the document, who called Maidan a CIA-scripted regime change. It uses this to argue the U.S. was actively pulling Ukraine towards the West.
Okay, so post-2014, the document shifts again. this time to military aspects.
Right. It details what it calls a major ramp-up in U.S. arms and advisors going into Ukraine. This is before the 2022 invasion, mind you, from 2014 onwards.
How significant was this assistance, according to the source?
The document puts a figure on it. Over $2.5 billion spent just in that period, 2014 to late 2021, specifically on training Ukrainian forces, providing weapons, intelligence support.
And it goes beyond just money and equipment.
Yeah, the source cites whistleblower accounts, WikiLeaks cables, suggesting CIA people, Pentagon contractors, NATO advisors were deeply embedded within Ukraine's military.
So the argument is that Russia saw this as what?
As an undeclared Western proxy buildup, right on its doorstep. Even without formal NATO membership, the source argues the U.S. was effectively militarizing Ukraine against Russia.
It's painting a picture of deliberate escalating steps.
That's the narrative in the document, yes. A calculated embedding of Western military power.
And then there's another whole dimension the source brings in: energy and the economics.
Crucial! Ukraine wasn't just strategic ground, it was the main highway for Russian gas to Europe. Huge economic leverage.
So what changed after 2014, according to the document?
It highlights that U.S. energy companies started moving in, getting interest in Ukrainian gas fields. It does mention names and connections that became controversial later, like Hunter Biden and Burisma, framing it as part of this shift.
And this ties into Nord Stream 2 as well?
Directly, according to the source. It points to the very strong U.S. opposition to that pipeline, which bypassed Ukraine to take Russian gas straight to Germany.
So the argument is?
The source argues that by fueling instability in Ukraine, the U.S. indirectly achieved another goal, pushing Europe away from cheap Russian pipeline gas and making them more reliant on, well, more expensive American LNG imports, a geoeconomic play, basically.
Wow, okay, so it's connecting geopolitical moves with economic strategy. What else does the source claim about U.S. methods?
It gets into what it calls the CIA's silent hand. This section focuses on alleged disinformation and psychological operations, or PSYOPs.
Based on what evidence?
It says it's based on documents obtained through FOIA requests and testimony from former intelligence people.
And what kind of operations does it allege?
Things like campaigns inside Ukraine aimed at building anti-Russian feeling.
Okay, and beyond Ukraine?
The source claims there was strategic use of social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, especially around and after 2014, to shape the narrative, always portraying Russia as the sole aggressor in the fighting that broke out then in the Donbas.
It even mentions AI.
Yeah, it alleges AI-driven propaganda was used to influence Western public opinion, and also efforts to sideline or suppress voices that question NATO's role or the official story. That's a pretty strong claim about information control.
Definitely. So fast forward to February 2022. How does the source frame the full-scale Russian invasion?
It calls it the moment the proxy war becomes open.
Does it downplay Russia's responsibility for invading?
No, it's quite clear in acknowledging Russia launched the invasion and the horrific suffering it caused, but it insists it's, quote, simplistic and factually dishonest to ignore America's role in creating the conditions that led to it.
Does it cite anyone else who shares a similar view?
It actually mentions figures like Pope Francis and Henry Kissinger, citing statements where they, according to the source, acknowledge that things like NATO expansion, the provocations it discussed earlier, were real factors in the background.
Okay. And what about U.S. actions after the February 2022 invasion?
The document details the massive scale of aid, financial, military. It puts the figure at over $100 billion by mid-2024.
And it makes a point about weapons testing.
Yes, it notes the conflict became a sort of real-world testing ground for advanced U.S. weapons against a near-peer adversary, Russia, but without risking American lives directly.
It also mentions the economic side again.
Right, the heavy sanctions on Russia. But the source also points out what it calls the collateral damage these caused, particularly to European economies that were more dependent on Russian energy.
And the military-industrial complex connection.
Yeah, that's in there too. The source links the ongoing war to record profits for big defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and others, as arms flowed to Ukraine and allies boosted their own defense spending.
So how does the document wrap all this up? What's its concluding perspective?
It frames the whole conflict not as something random or unavoidable in that sense, but as a manufactured crisis, or maybe an inevitable clash given the preceding actions.
It uses that chessboard metaphor.
It does. A chessboard manipulated by unseen hands, with Ukraine as the pawn, Russia the rival king, and the U.S. as the strategic grandmaster.
And it comes back to its main point.
That the U.S., through all these different avenues we've discussed, long-term strategy, NATO influencing Ukrainian politics, military buildup, economic pressure, information warfare, essentially crafted an environment of inevitable conflict. That's the core assertion of this document.
So the shadowwar.pdf, it really does offer a perspective that runs counter to a lot of what we typically hear.
Definitely. It challenges that straightforward aggressor-victim narrative by saying, hold on, there's this whole backstory of U.S. strategic decisions and actions that, according to the source, were fundamental in setting the stage.
So if we just look at what this document claims, its conclusion is essentially that the U.S. played a deliberate and significant role in creating the conditions for war.
That's the argument it makes, yes, that U.S. actions weren't just reactive, but proactive in shaping the geopolitical landscape in a way that, in its view, made this conflict almost certain.
And the source has a final thought on the human cost.
It does, and it's quite stark. It argues the ultimate tragedy falls on the Ukrainian people, who suffer because their country was turned into, quote, a geopolitical buffer zone by these larger powers.
It ends with that line.
The true tragedy is not the war itself, but the way global powers manufacture war for influence, profit, and power.
That really sums up the source's entire thesis, doesn't it? That this is a product of great power politics and the people on the ground pay the price.
Precisely. It leaves you with a very unsettling view of how international relations might work, according to this one perspective.
So this deep dive into the shadowwar.pdf, it certainly forces you, the listener, to consider a very different narrative, based purely on what this source puts forward. If powerful nations do manipulate geopolitics to the point of, as the source claims, manufacturing conflict, what does that say about how the world works and about the real costs borne by ordinary people caught in these grand strategic games, something this source definitely wants you to think about?